when we can fully stop and begin to listen to what our bodies are saying to us or what our emotions are saying to us through our bodies, using dance could help people begin to deal with grief and repressed emotion.
Sandy Oshiro Rosen is a dance director, arts mentor, author, and live performance venue owner of Bez Arts Hub.
In North American culture, not a lot of space for sorrow or grief. We wanted to go on quick microwave speed. Let's be over it.
To go at the speed of our emotions, we have to go at the speed of life. And unfortunately, when the emotions get left behind, then something snaps in our mental health and our physical health because our emotions are still stuck where they're stuck. And so we have to pause and slow down and pay attention to them, give them voice, and give them permission to exist.
I just want to quickly thank you for stopping by and starting to watch this Pause to Elevate podcast. If we haven't met before, I am Dr. Kasim Al-Mashat, registered psychologist, mindfulness teacher trainer, and just a human interested in mindset, mindfulness, and principles in psychology that can make a difference in your daily life. My mission is to support you in understanding your mind to transform your life. If you've subscribed, thank you so much. If you haven't done yet, go ahead and click that button. It really helps me to keep this going and reach out to more guests. You can also join our community by signing up to the free newsletter right over here, and it will keep you up to date on online courses about laughter, mindfulness, retreats, online programs, a lot of goodies. Would love to see you there. Meanwhile, enjoy this episode, but it's really intended to be for educational purposes and not a replacement for any advice, care, or direction from a healthcare provider. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I've been really looking forward to sharing today's conversation about an important topic with my guest, Sandy Oshiro Rosen. She has spent many years working alongside individuals for whom dance and movement have become an avenue for emotional expression and embodiment of trauma and unhealed feelings. She's a dance director, arts mentor, author, and live performance venue owner of Bez Arts Hub in Langley, BC, Canada. She has a unique approach to the arts, which has focused specifically on caring for the whole person and using the arts to foster community, personal care, and bringing voice beyond words. Her book, Bear, The Misplaced Art of Grieving and Dancing, looks at stories and studies that connect the process of grieving to permission to express that grief specifically through movement and dance. If you've been affected by emotional pain and any form of loss, this episode might be for you. Sandy, welcome to the Pause to Elevate podcast.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having me.
Thank you so much. So wonderful. I've been truly looking forward to this conversation for a couple of months. So happy we can make it happen today. I'm wondering if we can begin with what led you to this interest in emotional expression through the arts?
The whole idea of the arts is something that my husband and I have been involved with for many years. I took my dance training at Simon Fraser University. I have traveled and done music and recorded albums and original music and written songs with my husband we've been married now 40 years. So pretty much most of our life, we've been doing those things. And I think for many, many years, it was just, that was what we did. That's how we, in part made a living, in part kind of walked out our life. And when my kids were young, I kind of stumbled into the territory of dance a little more deeply. We had been doing a lot of music as most of our life, but suddenly with my kids, I felt like they couldn't keep traipsing along behind us. And so I needed to give them some avenues of things to do and express. And I started getting them involved with dance
Mm.
at the local school of dance. And we went to the first recital, and my husband and I were thoroughly embarrassed by a lot of the dance we were
Mm.
seeing on stage that was very age inappropriate. Kids
Oh.
dressed in ways that weren't appropriate for their age, and music and
Mm.
suggestive things
Like
in the
sexual.
music. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of decided, okay, that's not for my kids. So I
Mm.
decided to start a dance class in my living room for my kids and their friends. And
Hmm.
within a year and a half, I suddenly had 11 dance classes happening in my living room.
Oh, wow. That's a busy living room.
Yes. Our family life would kind of shut down. And and it was just evident that a lot of parents were feeling the same thing that I was. They wanted something more
Mm.
wholesome for their kids, and are creating this opportunity for dance that was more age appropriate, more wholesome, really met a need. So I suddenly was the director of a dance studio
Huh.
without much effort. And um, as I continued through the years with the dance school, I then started to develop a program to train up dance instructors who needed more training
Mm.
and who needed opportunity to kind of learn how to craft dance, and then also to
Mm.
kind of care for them as a whole person. And what suddenly started to happen as we were doing these more intensive classes and more
Mm.
delving into the personal lives of those dancers, um, suddenly they'd be at the bar doing a ballet class and they would burst into tears, suddenly
Mm.
remembering sexual abuse or emotional trauma. And
Mm.
um, and I suddenly went, oh, okay, so this is interesting. It looks to me like dance and movement is giving people the opportunity to release repressed emotion or suppressed emotion. And so I had been watching that for a number of years as I had been working with many of these young adults, and um,
Mm.
finding out how these things even could be expressed through dance. And specifically, if you read the first chapter of my book,
Mm.
there's a story of my one of my key instructors who, in some of those first years, she was pregnant with her first child, and
Mm.
um, she lost the child a week before it was due to be born, and that very traumatic event, um,
Mm.
strangely, and I mentioned this also in the book, that she woke up the second night after having given birth to this stillborn baby, and
Mm.
she called me and she said, Sandy, my husband is going to think I'm crazy, but I need you to come over. I have to tell you what I've been thinking about all night. And
Mm.
so I went over to her house. She started to unfold for me a dance production that she began
Mm.
to imagine in her head that was all about the trying to express the trauma of this event. And
Ah.
it was so fascinating that she had laid out every aspect of what she hadn't even gone through the grief yet, but she kind of anticipated what was coming and had a whole dance production figured out. And so through the course of that year, she and I, she had called me and said, I don't know if I can teach this year because this has hit me so deeply. And I said, you know
Mm.
what? I think that this is a trauma that we can go through with you. So I
Oh.
said, if you show up to class on any given day and you can't do the class, we will sit with you and we will weep with you and we
Oh,
will
wow.
support you and do whatever it takes to help you through this. So it was actually a stunningly beautiful year
Mm.
where very often we would stop the class and she would crumple on the floor in somebody's lap
Mm.
and start to weep, and we would just kind of hug her and hold her, or comfort her, and some of the
Mm.
dancers would get up and dance around her, and it just became this communal grieving, and
Mm.
kind of a an exceptional way for her to walk through it. Um,
Mm.
and I'm going to keep going. I'm sorry, this is kind of a long
This
little
is really
explanation.
important story.
Yeah, well, so then what did happen, because she was working with these dancers who were involved in our pre-professional program, she
Mm.
then began to craft dance pieces each period of her grieving process. So,
Oh.
the shock period, she created a whole piece connected to what that shock was like. People throwing out their arms and wordless screams,
Mm.
and then there is kind of the denial that it's happening, and not
Mhm.
being able to be comforted, and so a whole dance piece was about that. And then
Oh.
another one, this was an interesting one, where she had created chalk lines all around the floor, and her examining, essentially, what have I done wrong? What could I have done differently? How did this,
Oh.
and trying to figure that all out. So the whole production, I think there was 5 or 6 pieces, then created this um, emotional scape through dance.
Mm.
And that kind of became the template for what I knew could happen using dance,
Mm.
and what I suspected could be utilized to help other people begin to deal with grief and repressed emotion. So,
Mm.
long story.
Well, what a truly beautiful story of healing
Yeah,
and transformation,
yeah,
which allowed space to be held. Like there's space for her to feel with community and to
yeah,
be witnessed and to be supported, and for her to connect to all the different elements of grief, all the different, like, it's grief is messy.
yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah,
Sometimes we look for like quick solution. I need to be over this thing in a week and get
right,
back to work.
right. Yeah,
But that's not how grief works.
not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it
Mm.
was, and it was, for her, she continued to teach with us, and we had developed this pre-professional program together. So we worked together for many years. For
Mm.
her, even though we had this very supportive, strong opportunity for her to have space to grieve, it was still another 5 years before she kind of
Mm.
had stepped out the other side of the heaviness of it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was important for me. It was really the first that I had experienced that level of grief so close. Um,
Mm.
and then, so it was kind of like, oh wow, I better pay attention to this. Uh, and then over the next 3 or 4 years after that, my life kind of hit numerous, major grief
Mm.
scenarios, and it was so interesting that regardless of whether the grief was something like the loss of a child, or in my case, the
Mhm.
loss of a parent, um,
Mm.
or things that had happened in my life that just had traumatized me, the death of dreams, or as I say in the book, I call it spiritual miscarriage, where things that
Mm.
you anticipated would happen a certain way, and then it doesn't pan out. There's a grief that goes with that, and it was
Mm.
fascinating. in a conversation I was having with her one day, and I was describing the grief of this situation where I had.
Mhm.
It was kind of something that I had hoped would work out a certain way, and then it didn't, and I was kind of cast aside and scorned, and different things had happened, and I was describing the emotion that I felt about that, and she said, "Sandy, that is exactly the same thing that I felt in the grief of the loss of my baby."
Oh.
And so that kind of became the foundation of where I went when I wrote what I did in Bear, because I
Mhm.
thought, oh, this is actually really important for us to understand that grief comes from many different things, not just
Mm.
from death, which
Mhm.
is kind of what we associate it with. It's many, many things, and so I kind of unpack all of that. Yeah.
Mm. I really appreciate this wording that you've used in the book and that you're explaining here, this spiritual miscarriage,
Mm,
like something that, didn't go the way we wanted,
yeah.
and that there's loss. So, uh, working with people one on one and in groups, I see that often,
Mm,
that moving can be a loss, even if it's a good move.
yeah.
Losing a job, like there's so many ways we experience loss. What are the different forms of loss, would you say, that you've seen?
Well, a lot of it comes, it's interesting that um, one of the deep, deep griefs of my life was a rejection that I experienced in junior high school.
Mm.
And my all my girlfriends had rejected me. They said, you're whatever fault they found in me, which I'm sure there were many, but they just kind of said halfway through my grade 7 year, said, we don't want to hang out with you anymore. And
Oh
I've
wow.
suddenly found myself cast out of my friend group. I was completely alone. Um, and
Mm.
that deep grief stuck with me until I was in my 40s,
Ah.
and I had to go through a process of grief. So it can be everything from I was rejected by friends or family, a divorce
Mm.
happened, we moved, and none of my friends from my previous life continued to stay in touch with me. Um, I
Mm.
was working in a job and I was fired for unjust reasons.
Yeah.
All those kinds of things create in us a grief that kind of, the only way I can explain it, it literally gets stuck in our bodies.
Mhm.
And um, a lot of scientific evidence now tells us that right to the very level of our cells, it does
Mhm.
something to cause dysregulation within our bodies, and
Mhm.
ultimately, what I would say, we probably acknowledge more often that it can cause psychological illness, mental illness.
Mhm.
But what we don't often recognize is that it can cause physical illness,
Mm.
and
Mm.
right to the level of our bodies and our physiology.
And this is the cost of unexpressed grief. Is that what you
Yeah,
mean? Like this is the
yeah,
cost of when
yeah.
this is
Or
not
what?
expressed, or we're not tuned into it, or it's
Yeah,
suppressed. That there's a cost.
yeah. It's
Mm.
it's it's even what you read in my bio, unhealed
Mm.
feeling, and
Mm.
it's not just about a cost. It's about the fact that
Mm.
um, our body, our emotional selves, our mental selves, and our physiological selves are meant to be communicating with one another constantly. So
Mm.
as soon as we have a repressed emotion or a stoppage from permitting that emotion to be there. So abuse is a big one
Yeah.
um, because very often you have to completely shut down the acknowledgement of that happening in order to
Mm.
protect the secret or what have
Yeah.
you,
To survive.
to survive. Exactly.
Mm.
And so what happens is that all of the the bidirectional communication that's meant to be happening between our cells and our minds and
Mm,
our our emotional selves, it gets blocked at the place where you have
mm,
to stop the processing of what happened with that traumatic event. And that blockage um, literally becomes a physiological blockage. Our cells stop communicating with one another
mm.
at the cellular level of our bodies, and it causes then ailments. A lot of the work of Candace Pert, and
Mhm,
if you've, I'm sure you've read lots and done lots with Gabor Mate.
mhm.
Um, and I think that there's so much evidence in the territory of illness and disease that
Yes.
is very connected to this whole idea of emotions not being given space to be expressed, and how
Mm,
that becomes an inhibitor within our body and how it functions.
mm. So there's something about being in our body, embodiment,
Yeah.
embodiment through movement. And it's interesting, I see that as well with mindfulness. I teach mindfulness and mindfulness based stress reduction. And I
Hmm.
see when people begin connecting with your body as we meditate, scan the body, it's like, oh, there's a whole world that I've existed outside of.
Yeah.
And you're mentioning about the research. The first time I came across it was 2002, 2003 in my graduate work, and Vanderkalt. And
Mm.
Vanderkalk's work on the body keeps a score.
Right.
For me at the time, I mean, still is kind of amazing that the body keeps memory. It's not just this brain that keeps memory,
Right.
our body keeps memory.
Yeah.
And so when we go back to this story you began with, someone through movement and dance suddenly tearing up, or sometimes people go do a massage and they like just some started crying and like don't know
Right.
why.
Right.
So what an incredible wisdom this body is.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm,
Well, and so fascinating. Um, One of the ways in which I've then flipped my understanding of this
mm,
is to begin to um, connect, permit individuals to connect to what might be happening in their bodies. And
mm.
there's a limitation to talk therapy. There's the word I'm looking for. There's a limitation to
Yes,
talk
yes.
therapy, because even if you think of,
Mm,
and I experienced this with one of my students, um, if there's a trauma that happens
mm.
to you when you're very young, either pre-verbally or when your verbal
Yeah.
acuity is not sufficient enough to begin to express the scope of a trauma, or a situation that
Mhm,
you've experienced, then talk therapy doesn't work. There
mm,
aren't words to begin to describe it. So in the first couple of years when I had developed a program called Dancing for Healing, probably calling it Revive
mm.
now or something like that. Um,
Yes.
and what um, I discovered through some of my students is that they had been through talk therapy many years, but there kept being a thing that they couldn't access.
Mm,
And so what I would say is, I want you to kind of feel sense within your body any place of heaviness or tightness, because very
mm,
often it'll manifest as that in our bodies. And if you were to express with movement what
mm,
that heaviness or tightness or even emotion feels like, I want you to just
mhm,
do that. So it actually is giving that emotion a voice through movement, without having to
mm.
having your brain interfere with what that is. Because very often our
Right. Or
brains,
analyze it or
yeah, and not just analyze it, but we've already
mm,
utilized our brain to shut it down. If it's a trauma,
mm,
our brain already has shut it out as not existing. but our body says, but I remember it. So the body,
Mm,
by accessing our bodies in order to begin to express those things,
mm,
then suddenly there's this other dimension of voice and communication that a person has. And so, for one of my students, she began to flail her hands, and
mm,
and um, when she unpacked it afterwards, and we do sometimes have a debriefing time, not necessarily what needs to happen, but sometimes if they want
mhm.
to let it make sense to their minds, they will express it verbally. And she began to express the story of when she was a
Ah,
toddler, and her father had died very traumatically, and she was, a toddler, so everybody said, well, she doesn't understand, let's
she's not gonna remember. Yeah,
that's right,
yeah.
that's right. This is no
That's the
big deal to
misconception.
her. We'll go send her with grandma, and
Yeah.
mom is having a nervous breakdown, but we'll just let her be. And
Mm,
because she fully, as a toddler, fully understood what was happening. Her father was
mm,
gone. It was a traumatic experience. Her mom had a nervous breakdown, and she had no voice. and
ah,
and so this feeling of flailing her hands suddenly became her saying, give me a voice, let me be heard, this
ah,
trauma affected me, and let me begin to process it. So here she was, a 50-year-old woman, finally processing something that happened to her when
mm,
she was 3 years old. So it's
mm,
fascinating that by accessing movement in order to begin to voice those emotions, it's pretty powerful.
mm.
Yeah.
That's incredibly powerful. You
Hmm.
know, I really appreciate the description that you're providing about healing and the different doorways to healing. And here's a very powerful way that our body has wisdom using
Hmm.
movement in the body. And it's
Hmm.
so interesting. I see that too in the work that I do in the counseling. Is there's some ways that's not helpful, like just the talking, as you're saying,
Yeah.
but there's like somatic experiencing in therapy
Hmm.
where people
Hmm.
are getting in touch with their body, or EMDR, eye
Right.
movement reprocessing and
Right.
desensitization. So there's like getting connecting to something the brain logically does not understand.
Yeah.
And I think that's very powerful when we trust a deeper wisdom outside of logic. We've overvalued logic.
Right.
Logically, I should be over it.
Right.
Yeah, but your nervous system and your body hasn't.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
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 And also that trauma is open ended. So if
Yeah.
it isn't processed and brought, if there isn't closure brought to it, every situation that you encounter that is similar to that trauma, it becomes just an
Mm.
extension of the trauma. and
Yeah.
and so people, why can't I get out of this, why can't I feel differently about this, and why do these things keep happening to me? And it's
Yes.
because it's because they can't individuate each circumstance as a different event. It's all an extension of the
Mm.
same trauma that still is open and has not
Mm.
been processed and finished.
Mm.
Yeah.
So what you've created that you said you may call revive, the new name of it. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if someone is interested in that, how does that work? Is it like a day type of event? Is it a series of events? Like, what does your program look like for someone who's interested?
um What it normally has been, it's been a weekly class, and
Mm,
and because I run a dance studio slash arts venue,
mm,
it becomes just one of my classes where
mm,
students can, they'll come in for an hour. I will walk them through, generally a class of 8 or less students,
mm,
and I will walk them through would kind of be more like a bodily meditation versus,
mm,
it's a real connecting to what's happening within their body. So we'll start,
mhm,
laying on a mat and beginning to feel what's happening. And I find some of my students, their husbands say, "So are you going to your breathe and cry class again?" because a
A
lot of
breathe and cry.
because a lot of what we end up doing is, for most of us, just life is so hectic and busy, and we don't get to process things that are happening through a day or through a week that has impacted us emotionally. And so when we can fully stop and just lay there and begin to listen to what our bodies are saying to us, or what our emotions are saying to us through our bodies, um,
Mm,
suddenly people will start to go, "Oh yeah, that interaction with that other mom in the parking
mm,
lot really affected me, and I didn't get to process that. So now I'm going to feel that, and I'm going to cry, and I'm going to start to bring comfort to myself." And very often it'll just start with just kind of
mm,
physical, letting that emotion be in our bodies and be acceptable to us, and
mm,
acknowledged and touched and comforted. Sometimes it's just that, um, and then as we kind of carry on week to week, we'll kind of go a little bit further, and we'll begin to
mm,
talk about. So if that feeling in your body, which you can maybe now acknowledge as a particular emotion, how would you want to respond to it or express it? and
mm.
and they will do it through movement. And sometimes it's the simplest of movement, like I said, sometimes just a flailing of hands, and
Yes.
sometimes it's a pounding or a stomping, or sometimes they just need to release it, fully bodily, and
Mm,
they begin to, do some sort of movement. But it's not a scripted movement. It's not a choreographed
mm,
movement. It's just letting their bodies begin to do what they need to do in order to respond to those
mm.
emotions. Yeah.
As you're sharing this, you remind me of a teacher, yoga teacher, who often said, just listen to your body.
Hmm.
It's smarter than you.
Yeah.
like, like
Yeah.
let your body move you
Yeah.
instead of thinking I should be doing this or this stretch
Right.
or this move. I should be doing this. Rather than like, what's emerging in the moment that
Right.
my body is telling me. and
Right.
and the work you're doing is just feels like creating this harmony between mind and body,
Yeah.
which they're not separate, but somehow we live in the head and think the body is later. I don't have time for it.
Exactly. Well, and this is what I do a little demonstration in my classes, where I have three light bulbs. One is body, soul, um, spirit, and I put a big elastic around it, and I get different people to hold on to those
Mm,
light bulbs as they go further and further away. Because I say very often what happens is that
mm,
our um, our body, even our spirits, whatever that is, how that engages with us. But we can often like just kind of go,
mm.
well, we can get above this. It'll be fine. We'll just keep going.
Oh,
And so those things keep going, but our souls, our emotions are
mm,
stuck wherever those emotions are stuck. and
mm,
and so what I kind of describe, if your body, your spiritual rising above it, just keep going, that elastic gets more and more taut and tight, and at
mm.
some point something's going to snap. And I
Ah,
then encourage my students to go, okay, bring spirit, bring body back to going at the speed of what your emotions, your soul
mm,
is going at, and only move as your emotions or as your soul feels like it can move right now. And what's fascinating is when I started the program, for the first when I kept saying only go at the speed of your emotions, for the first 6 weeks the students were just moving like this. Just and I'm
tiny
like,
bit.
am I doing something wrong here? This should be working better. But it was literally taking that long for
Mm,
them to give permission for their emotions to be slow, and their emotions to slowly express what they needed to express.
Mm.
And we are a fast society, and so there isn't permission to go at the speed of our emotions. We have to go at the speed of life. And unfortunately, when the emotions get left behind, then something snaps in our mental health, or something
Mm.
snaps in our physical health, because our
Mm.
emotions are still stuck where they're stuck. And so we have to pause and slow down and pay attention to them and give them voice
Mm.
and give them permission to exist.
Mm.
Yeah.
You just used as well the word of pause, which is really the name of this podcast, pause to elevate. Like you're
Yeah.
describing many ways that just taking a step, pausing, this slowing down,
Yeah.
because we can't really hurry up healing.
No.
We,
No.
we we want it to go on like quick, like microwave speed. Quick, let's cook it.
Right.
Let's be
Right.
over it. And
Right.
what do you sense? What is that? Like a bit of in North American culture, like not a lot of
Yeah.
space for sorrow or grief.
No. No.
Yeah.
No. And we have been preached at about productivity as being, pushing ourselves beyond what we can do, what we
Mm.
have capacity for. And a lot of what I talk to my students about is you only have so much capacity. And
Mm.
so if you continue to drain your capacity to do things, um, you're running on empty, and it's no wonder that you have anxiety. It's no wonder that
Yeah.
you feel stressed all the time, or fear, or suddenly you're developing physical ailments.
Mm.
All those things are connected to the fact that we are a society that so values productivity that we
Mm.
don't have a grid for what it is to pause. Which, interestingly, that first dance production that we did around the stillborn baby was called Pause as well.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah. And I have a whole chapter
Mm.
at the end of my book that is called
Mm.
Stop.
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
because we have to, at certain moments in our lives, just stop, because
Yeah.
everything in our beings is crying out to pay attention to something that we won't pay attention to
Mm.
if we're in perpetual motion. and
Mm.
and that kind of is how we live our lives, is kind of so highly valuing this perpetual motion,
Yeah.
that the moments that we need to stop, like probably the best gift to all of us in our families and in our work lives, was COVID, because we had to
Mm.
stop. We couldn't do a thing. And
Mm.
there was a huge gift in the whole world having to not do anything. Family
Yeah.
lives were suddenly valued. People
Mm.
started attending to their mental health.
Yeah.
It was a real gift to us that we were
Mm.
forced to stop and had permission to stop. And I
Mm.
think that that's a huge key, that we do that.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. Sometimes it takes really bad things to happen for us to stop. And
Yeah.
I have to tell you, that was my own journey as well in the
Mm.
early 2000s, is, just breaking down, going
Mm.
on disability from work. And it
Ah,
led me to this whole path of, counseling work and meditation and mindfulness, and
right.
looking closer into my own, like, how am I living life? And it's been so priceless, this just pausing,
Yeah.
sitting with my emotions, sitting with my being, my body, with meditations. Like,
Right.
oh, there's more to life than just sprinting to the next thing.
Right. Right.
Right? Like, as you said, we value, let's sprint to the next thing. And then
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't stop.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we aren't even paying attention to the fact that not only are there those emotions that um, are unhealed and that need attention,
Mm,
But just even our ability to keep going,
mm,
and not getting filled up, not giving our emotions or our beings the ability to get filled up with things
yeah.
that help to. I can't talk about it differently than saying to fill our tanks, and
Yeah.
it's pretty simple and basic. And actually talking about that, because we often talk about that with our children, talk about
Mm.
filling you we need to fill their tanks, da, da, da.
Yes.
But what is interesting, and I've worked with parents recently, as I've talked about this connecting with your body and giving yourself permission to pause and listen to yourself.
Mm,
Parents who suddenly go, "Oh, so my kid, when they're stomping around, that's actually a good thing." And I
ah,
said, "Yeah, because that is them, a kid who does not have the words to talk about how
mm,
their tank hasn't been filled or how they're upset about something that happened in the day. They often don't have the words to express it, so their expression becomes physical, but we keep
mhm.
shutting down their physical
Yes.
response because it's inappropriate in our society. And these parents suddenly going, light bulb moment, I need to let my kid say what they're trying to say through that, and do it with
Mm,
them. What does it feel like? What you're feeling inside? You feel like you want to stomp around? Let's stomp around so that we can
mm,
begin to express what that is that you're experiencing.
mm.
And to give more permission for how kids are physically trying to
Mhm.
express the things that they don't have the verbal capabilities to begin to express.
And they're more tuned than us as
No,
adults. Like, there's
absolutely,
less filters.
absolutely.
We have so many filters. Like, I shouldn't do this. I'm not supposed to do this. I gotta be an adult. And kids are just removing expression. So, really important what you're sharing here. Just allowing space for kids and maybe the older kids, like all of us, to express through movement. How beautiful as you're
Yeah,
sharing that.
yeah.
I'm wondering as well about, the cultural expression of grief. And, you know, I've experienced it in many forms. And in the Middle East, when someone passes away in many of the countries, is, you wear black.
Mhm.
And I know my grandmother did that. My mother did that after my father passed away. And it's becomes this way of remembering.
Yeah, yeah,
And growing up, seeing that often, like, it kind of bothered me. I'm like, why are they so wearing black? Like, I want color, right? I didn't understand it.
yeah,
But looking back and looking at your book, it's like, uh, you helped me see it again. Like, wait a minute, that gave us permission to go, someone just had a loss, and it's not like over in a week. You're
yeah,
still wearing black 40 days, a year after, some even longer.
yeah. Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I had one of my dancers who she was really struggling to process the loss of a very, very close family friend.
Mm,
Again, she ended up doing a whole dance production connected to that loss as well.
mm,
But she just kept saying, I don't know why. I just still don't feel right. I still don't feel right. And I mentioned that chapter in my book about wearing black.
mm,
And and so she did that for the next several months. She wore black
mm.
until she felt like she was through it.
Yeah.
And it's not just a reminder to other people, it's a reminder to ourselves to
Mm,
give ourselves room to continue to grieve and to
mm.
continue to accept that this grief continues to be messy. It continues to inhibit my productivity. It continues to
Yes.
make me feel slow and lethargic, and it continues to make me feel unsociable.
Mm,
And I think you're absolutely right that we have lost something
mm.
in the loss of the practice of wearing black, because people need to be reminded that we're still grieving instead of going,
Yeah.
well, it's been a month now, why are you not up
Should
and
be over,
going?
yeah.
Let's get
Yeah.
on with it. And
Let's move on.
yeah, and it needs to continually be. And what was great about my friend who experienced the loss of this baby, when I then was experiencing my grief, she would
Mm,
sit with me in it until I was done.
mm,
And we kind of did that back and forth for one another whenever there was a big loss, whenever there was something that was happening, that we would just kind of say, are you still in it? Okay, I'm with you. Are you still in it? I'm still with you.
yeah.
And to not just have, where it used to be a societal thing that everybody would continue to bring food to your house and
Yes.
be with you in it. We don't have that anymore.
It's
And
like 1 week, first couple of days,
yeah, yeah,
people bring food, take care of you, and then
yeah.
back to being busy, right?
That's right, that's right, and
Mm,
people need to know that there are other people with them in the grief while they're going through it,
mm,
because grief is the loneliest time of our lives.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And unavoidable, unfortunately. As
yeah,
long as we're human, we're going to
yeah,
experience loss,
yeah,
and many forms and different forms affects us at different times
yeah,
differently. Loss of a
mhm,
pet, um, or even moving, I mentioned earlier, sometimes it may not affect us. Next time it may affect us. So
right.
there isn't a formula. People look for a formula, but it's
Mm,
really an ebb and flow of human expression
exactly,
that comes and
exactly.
goes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
In your book as well, it's not a like one of these self-help, like do this and get that, but you do share some coping ways. And I'm wondering, for those who may not be able to access in person, they might be not in the area, the work you're doing, what are different ways you found helpful that to cope with loss, different forms of loss?
Well, I think the most helpful thing again is that final chapter about stop.
Mm,
And it really is about, um, letting ourselves gain access to what it is that we're feeling on the deeper level, and to
mm,
pause with those feelings, to understand what they are, to be able to communicate them to the people around us so that
mm,
they know what we're going through. um, to find people around us that, a big thing is actually being given permission to grieve.
mm,
That's big, because when we don't feel like we have permission,
yeah.
then we do keep rushing ourselves through it, um, because it just feels indulgent. And
Mhm.
I hear this very often from people. They say, "But if I start crying, I feel like I won't ever stop crying." And there
Yeah.
is there is an incessant part of weeping and grieving
Mm,
that does feel like it's endless. And so we need to have permission that that's actually still okay. It does end.
mm, yeah,
Fortunately, I know it does end.
yeah.
But we need permission from people to say, let it flow, and
Mm,
it's okay if it continues endlessly. And I
mm,
remember I remember a couple of friends talking to me when I was grieving multiple things that had happened. My mom's death, a health crisis, a financial crisis,
mm,
the death of my father-in-law, and a bunch of things all happened in a package over a couple of years. And I kind of had said to my friends, like, this is something that it feels like I have to continue. And they kind of went, but it doesn't have to continue forever, all the time.
right.
And I'm like, well, it needs to continue until it's done. But there's just this feeling from our society that when we do let the grieving go as
Mm,
long as it needs to go, people kind of are slapping us on the wrist saying,
yeah,
but we're done now. This is enough.
yeah, yeah,
And unfortunately, it's not enough until it's enough. And
yeah,
nobody knows how long that is until we
yeah.
get through it. And so we
Mm,
need lots of people to support us and have room in order to do that. So find friends who have
mm,
have willingness and give you permission, each of you giving each other permission to go through whatever you're grieving at whatever time you need to
Mm.
grieve it.
See, this brings me to the last question I wanted to ask you. And your naming it really is the sense of community. So
Yeah,
to grieve, a community could be just friends, one
yeah,
friend, two
yeah,
friends,
yeah,
instead of in isolation, doing
yeah,
something on our own, because that's the only way we know, many of us.
yeah.
So something about community that you speak about. Can you say a little more about the importance of community in grieving?
Well, I think the biggest part with grief and I would add to it unhealed feeling and dealing with trauma, because we don't
Mm.
often think of trauma as grief. Um, but what I would say is that the most important thing that those feelings are needing is they are needing to be heard. And the
Mm.
only way that we can be heard is in a communal setting. And whether it's just one person that hears me and hears what the grief is, or a whole community of people that can come around that. I always suggest a community of people because sometimes the weight of our emotional traumas and difficulties are too much for one person. Um, but but
Mm.
it is about letting that thing finally be voiced, and that is the way
Mm.
that we kind of get it out of our bodies. It is
Yeah.
the physical, our voices become the physical manifestation of those emotions so that they can exist.
Mm.
And now that they've been communicated, then the blockages in our body that would stop, at those stuck feelings,
Mhm.
now that flow of communication can happen again, and then our physical and our mental health
Mm.
can begin to function properly again. And it's weird
Mm.
that just being able to voice it, whether probably the most touching thing that we do in these Dancing for Healing Revive classes is that I will sometimes get them to do a series of movements connected to something that they've expressed emotionally, and what I'll
Mm.
get a person to do is they will show the group that movement, and then the group will learn those movements and express
Ah.
them back to the person.
Oh,
And
that would be powerful. I'm just imagining
it
it. Yeah.
is so powerful. We get a lot of tears at that moment because
Mm.
it's not just that I got to express it, but now I'm understood. And even
Mm.
if the other people don't fully know what those movements mean, it speaks back to the person that they are understood, that they
Mm.
are accepted,
Mm.
that what they just said was heard.
Yeah.
And it's powerful. Very, very
Mm.
powerful. Mhm.
Well, truly, thank you for your incredible work that you've done and dedicated your life to. And I'm wondering, how can people find you? What's the best way for them to find you?
Um, Best place, I did have an author page at one point and do all that, but my venue now has become so busy with classes and concerts and arts things that we're
Mm.
doing. They really have to go to Bez Arts Hub. So they can
Yes.
get a hold of me at hello at Bez, BEZ, artshub.com.
Okay.
And I'll respond if they have interest. Currently, I'm not running any of those classes, but if there's interest, I will
Mm.
always start new classes
Yes,
in order to kind of attend to those needs.
okay, I will put that in the show notes, including the your book and how they can get your book. So I'll put all of that.
Great.
And really want to thank you for your time and sharing this wisdom that's inherent in all of us, this whole body wisdom. I really enjoyed this conversation. Really important part of being human.
Mm.
So thank you again. And I look forward to maybe connecting in person one day since we are in the
We're
same
not
area.
far away.
Almost not too far away.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all the listeners for listening or watching. May your moments be filled with ease and may you be present in as many of them. Thank you.